Welcome. This is Business Edge and our headline story for today. Sudan's recovery and growth prospects. Now, Sudan has shown incredible resilience in terms of making its way through several challenges that the country has faced. And we've seen that the international community is also appreciating this. Now, the transitional government led by Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok has been engaging the West, the East, and everyone in between to improve the country's economic fortunes after the ousting of Omar Al Bashir. Are these discussions bearing fruit? We'll tell you what you need to know as we focus on Sudan's road to recovery. I'm Tolulokwe Adila Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now, the international community appears to be appreciating Sudan's efforts to improve its economy, fight poverty, and all other economic reforms. To free up significant room for maneuver in the implementation of its development projects, now Sudan is hoping for a remission of 80% of its external debt, estimated at nearly $60 billion. Joining me is Ali Khan Satchu. He is a geo-economist and macro analyst. He's also the CEO of Rich Management. Ali Khan, thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Thank you for having me on your show.
So before we get into some of the steps that are being taken by Sudan's leadership for its economic recovery now, let's look at where the country is coming from. Even before Omar Al Bashir left office, the country was already suffering an acute economic meltdown. Inflation rose to a staggering 65%. There was stagnant growth that had been difficult to overcome. Sudan also lost much of its oil reserves when South Sudan became independent in 2011. In 2013, the government attempted to save funds by cutting fuel subsidies, which ended up leading to some fatal clashes between protesters and police in Khartoum. What were the effects of this economic situation at that time for Sudanese?
So that was an excellent description. And just to take you a bit further back, there was a time when per capita GDP in Sudan was about $3,700. And this slumped dramatically all the way to around $1,200. So you can see in that slump how difficult it became for the citizens of Sudan. There were sanctions. The Bashir regime really looked after a very narrow group of people at the cost of the broad citizenry. Inflation, ironically, was 65%, but it's now in triple digits. This is one of the problems that the current administration is dealing with. And of course, we had the independence of South Sudan. The oil resources, as you mentioned, were all the majority of them were in South Sudan. So there was a significant cut in government revenues in this period you're describing. And then, as it became more and more difficult for people to survive, we reached this tipping point moment that finally saw the ouster of Omar Al Bashir after more than 30 years in power. That revolution certainly was wonderful to watch unfold.
All right, so let's move forward a bit. There was a transitional leadership then put in place, helping the country to prepare for elections in 2022. But then we saw a very big challenge, not just for Sudan, but for many countries across the continent, and that was the pandemic. A report from the International Crisis Group in June of 2020 said that Sudan's state budget was deep in the red amid crippling shortages of basic commodities, extended power outages, and soaring inflation, as you're talking about, in the triple digits. We're a year down from the outbreak of the coronavirus. Where does Sudan stand now?
Sorry, I lost your sound momentarily.
Ali,
so
you are muted, I think. If you can check your audio so that we can hear you.
All right,
go ahead.
I've got it back now. Do you mind just repeating?
All right. So, Ali, we're not hearing you. I'm not sure what the issue is with the connection.
I lost you.
Okay, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
No, sorry. Can you just repeat the question? I'm really
All
sorry.
right, so my question was 1 year down from the pandemic, even though during that time we saw that the budget was in the red, there were commodity shortages, there were extended power outages. Where is Sudan now as we speak, as we have this conversation in May 2021?
So a good question. Obviously, the pandemic hit Sudan very badly, actually. There were reports, I think, by the Imperial College, which said that the pandemic was hugely undercounted in Khartoum in particular, and I suspect in the rest of the country. So, they had a very bad hit from the pandemic. As you know, basic commodity prices have surged much higher. They're still trying to bring them lower. But have not succeeded. Inflation is somewhere near 350%, which is extraordinary. But there are glimmers of hope, and I'll tell you why. The Hamdok administration has largely resolved its issues with the international countries like the US, the Europeans. The World Bank and the IMF are now in line and being very supportive. They have worked their way through a lot of these extant debt issues. As you know, Macron was the latest to host them, but the IMF and the World Bank also on side. African Development Bank is also supporting. GCC countries have also supported them. So they're in a much better position than they were. There are still serious challenges. I don't think we've had the trickle down to the average person. But in terms of geoeconomic, geopolitical moves, one can say they've really made some dramatic improvements. And, I think increasingly in an uncertain neighborhood, people are looking at Sudan and saying, this could be the anchor state, an important state for the region. You've seen Egypt reach out to them. You've seen many other countries. So I think there's enormous potential. And I think they are slowly on the runway. And if I looked forward 12 or 24 months, I've got to be extremely optimistic that they're going to see serious progress.
And that progress is what I want us to take up next, because you're talking about, of course, they're working things out with the U.S., getting off of the blacklist, working things out with the European Union, working things out with France from the summit on financing of African economies. But what steps have been deliberate, have been intentional from the transitional government that have helped to bring about this debt forgiveness and this extension of help and, I guess, financing, whatever you want to call it, that's coming Sudan's way right now?
So the first thing, of course, is that the transitional government is not Omar Al Bashir, and I think that helps. And I think and secondly, I think people are very optimistic about the potential of Sudan. There's a huge amount of potential. Agriculture, there is oil there. There are gold mines, and this is a country with enormous potential and a reasonably educated citizens. So lots of potential. But I think they played their cards very well. I think they reconciled. The big issue for the U.S. during the Trump administration was reconciliation with Israel. They did that. The quid pro quo from Pompeo was to basically bring them back into the League of Nations and stop the sanctions. And then I think that was really the catalyst for others to say, look, let's all take a fresh look at this new Sudan. And I think, going back to what we saw on the streets in 2019, it was such a powerful image of people who were looking for freedom, who were looking to escape the yoke of dictatorship. And I think that resonated with the world. And then I think, Hamdok and his people have been pretty smart. They remind me a little bit of the Egyptians. A lot of depth in the civil service, a lot of history, and ability to navigate the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the world. Under Bashir, this was not really utilized. They were playing a different game. But I think when I look at them now, they seem sophisticated, subtle, and to have got to this point, they really have achieved a lot. So, you know, a lot of potential, a lot of sophistication amongst the bureaucracy, and obviously Prime Minister Hamdok at the top has shown his ability to lead.
I have to ask, what do you think is in it for the Western countries? What is in it for the U.S.? What's in it for France? What's in it for the European Union, for the IMF? Because a lot of people will be a little bit anxious right now. This is a country that's coming out, we won't say of a civil war, but it's coming out of a very serious political turbulence and times. It's a country that's also rich, as you said, in natural resources, which we know that many African countries have not found a way to absolutely benefit from. And there are a lot of people who might be weary of this extension from the West, hoping that it's not a new form of neo-colonial financial slavery in one sense of the word. We've seen extensions from Russia in recent times, the Moscow Africa Summit. We've seen China. Now, of course, we saw France do another summit. So we are seeing that attention on the continent. But what's in it for the West, especially as they're forgiving so much debt, valued at close to about $60 billion for Sudan?
No, it's a very good question, and I think you know, nobody is operating on a charitable basis. Every country is looking at the financial returns that they can accrue from engaging with our countries, and in some cases, you know, don't forget, we also have agency as Africans. You know, I saw some comments by President Tshisekedi saying some of the deals that were done in the Congo were so plain egregious.
Yes.
So it's not just about the other side. The other side is looking at their national interests. They want to make returns on whatever investments they're making. And we should also be engaging on the same basis and holding our leaders to the same standard. Now, I think I think there's an economic interest. There's so much potential. I think different countries have different interests. You know, the GCC is all about securing food supplies. Sudan has these enormous tracts of land which are very fertile. So, you know, they're probably focusing in on that. The GCC is also looking at the wider neighborhood. This is an important Muslim country, and they want to keep them on side. You look at France, you know, France does not necessarily have the best reputation in Africa, and we've seen recent events in the Sahel in particular, which have not been really, I wouldn't call them optimal, though Macron likes going around saying he's of the new generation, he's of the Mandela generation. Well, let's see it a bit more in West Africa. But I think in terms of Sudan, the French, I know, have been working very hard at this for quite a number of years. I think they see a lot of potential and a potential stabilizer in terms of the geopolitics of the Sahel. The Sudanese military is quite sophisticated, and I think in an uncertain neighborhood where they previously relied on their partner in West Africa, I think they foresee Sudan being a strong partner in that regard. So overall, I'd say, look, everybody's looking at their own interests, and you know, we also have to look at ours. And the Sudanese strike me as pretty smart people, and they can handle what's best for them. At the end of the day, governments have got to look at how to benefit their citizens. Yeah. Otherwise, they're not going to last very long, and they're going to fall into that feedback loop of coups and counter coups and putches, which is a lot of what's happening in West Africa, I'm afraid.
And very true on that point. So, Ali Khan, we're going to take a break, but there are some numbers that I want all of us to hold on to. 2 billion. 1.5 billion and some $425 million. I'll tell you what they mean in relation to Sudan when Business Edge continues. Do stay with us. This is Business Edge right here on News Central, and we're taking a look at Sudan's recovery and growth prospects. Now, the country will benefit from $2 billion in funding from the World Bank, and that was announced by the World Bank Vice President for Eastern and Southern Africa during a visit to the country. We also know that one of the outcomes of the Summit for Financing Africa's Economies is that France has granted another $1.5 billion bridge loan to help clear Sudan's arrears to the IMF. And this is all part of efforts to pay off the country's debt. My guest, Ali Khan Sachu, is still with me. So, Ali Khan, take us through this bridge loan. This is yet another being extended to Sudan. How do these bridge loans work? And what do you think the impact will be in terms of the overall debt that the country has?
So, as you previously said, the overall debt seems to be around $60 billion. So the government of Sudan is trying to reduce that entire amount. At the same time, it's trying to release fresh money. In order to release fresh money, it's got to clear outstanding amounts owed to the big multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. This is something Zimbabwe is trying to do, but has not succeeded in doing. So what Sudan is doing is basically has relied on the likes of the US, now France. So the bridge loan is basically France giving this money to, I think it's the IMF or the World Bank, in order to clear arrears that Sudan has with those institutions, which then allows those institutions to make available to Sudan fresh money. So for the likes of the $2 billion loan that the World Bank is talking about. So, you know, what they're trying to do is restructure the balance sheet. It's you've gone into default in your business, you go back to the bank, you get some debt forgiveness, you get a bridging loan from somebody else to help clear the balance, put you back in compliance with the loan agreements. And so essentially what we're seeing are a series of moves which are going to mean that Sudan will be in a position to receive fresh money from multinationals and from other countries as they go forward. And it's much needed because they really need to stimulate and catalyze a recovery in their economy.
So I want to just a quick clarification. It is a bridge loan, which means then that it's now France that Sudan owes. Is that correct?
No, that's correct. So France is giving a loan on behalf of Sudan to clear the outstanding with the multilateral institution. But simultaneously, France was saying they were going to forgive, if I heard Macron correctly, they were going to forgive the legacy loans that were currently owed to France.
Okay.
So I suspect the end result is Sudan will owe France $1.5 billion and will be forgiven, I think, up to $5 billion, which has been non-performing for quite a long time.
This is something we can definitely call a sweetheart's deal for Sudan, of course, and France is not the only country extending this. But do you think with all of this extension of debt forgiveness, bridge loans happening, can we see the whole debt situation with Sudan being resolved before the end of 2021?
Absolutely. I think it's going to be resolved much earlier than the end of the year. I think what we're seeing is we're seeing the public events, but behind the scenes, I think the terms have all been agreed. So I expect this resolution to happen much faster, and it needs to. And I think people are invested in making it happen faster because, you know, you can see that the staple prices have risen considerably. Inflation's very high, and you need to stabilize the currency. And the nature of things is, you know, if you don't stabilize the government fast, then you're putting at risk the entire revolution that happened in 2019.
Very true. So just a quick note for our audience. There will be more financing possibly coming for Sudan, coming from the heavily indebted poor countries debt relief initiative. That's a space where they can get. And another number I told you to hold on to, that's the $425 million. Well, the United Kingdom and European unions are also working together to clear that $425 million debt that Sudan owes the African Development Bank. The United Arab Emirates also signed a deal with Sudan to provide petroleum products. So all of this is good. This is movement, the results of what the work that the transitional government has put in. But there was something you said earlier, trickle down. And that's a conversation that sometimes we miss out on when it comes to conversations on the continent, when it comes to debts and loans, the trickle-down economics of it. When does all of this start to trickle down to the Sudanese man, woman, and young child on the streets of the country?
So trickle-down has been the biggest problem on our continent, to be frank. We keep showing up GDP numbers, but in terms of the well-being of the average person on the street, I remember that refrain, "You can't eat GDP." Well,
nope.
Certainly in Sudan, there hasn't been any GDP to eat, which is more extreme. So what I was saying is, when is the person on the street going to see their prices of their staples come down, their incomes start to go up, more opportunities for them to work, more opportunities for their children, is what I mean by trickle down. And I think that's got to happen fast. It has not happened yet. In fact, it's been getting worse. People have been worse off in this period. The macroeconomics has been improving, the geoeconomics has been improving, but our events on the ground have not been improving. So I think the question is, how does this transitional government translate into very quick improvement on the ground? And I think they've got a plan for that, from what I can see. But that is going to be the key to unlocking the Sudanese opportunity.
So I'm going to ask you to expand on that. So we know there's a number of development projects and initiatives that the transitional government has identified. They're looking to put in to get us that trickle-down economics we're looking for. But beyond the debt relief, the debt forgiveness, the more financing coming in terms of the economic priorities of the transitional governments, what do you think they should be?
Well, I think what they should be is basically job creation and economic growth, right? And I think, when there are two ways to look at that. You can look at it, a lot of our leaders love to have these big projects and cut ribbons, and sometimes those infrastructure projects don't translate into hundreds and thousands of jobs. So my idea, and our people are extremely east to west, north to south, we're all entrepreneurial, just need the opportunity. So I think it's got to be on multiple levels. I think first level is to make it an exciting destination for anyone around the world, which they've already done. I saw the new rules and regulations for investments from outside, and particularly from Africa. I think, it's an untapped opportunity. I saw Mr. Dangote was saying he was going to go knocking on their door. So, it's not just about Mr. Dangote, it's about you and I. It's about our friends thinking, let's go and see what's going on in Khartoum. Maybe we open up a bit. And I said, for me, those are really the priorities that create jobs. And so you've got to stimulate the external environment. You've also got to stimulate the internal environment. And I think if I was sitting in leadership in Khartoum, I would be working on stimulating the internal environment. And I think make it a fair playing field, create opportunities, make it easy, like Rwanda. It takes 24 hours to open a business. You're up and running in 48 hours. Make it like that, because, what we've learned from last year and the pandemic is digitization is accelerating everywhere. Digitize Sudan, go for it. And I think they'll reap a very big reward.
All right, Ali Khan Satru, thank you so much for joining me. Geo-economist, macro analyst, and the CEO of Rich Management, and we'll definitely have you back on Business Edge. Do have a pleasant day.
Thank you so much.
All right. And as we wrap things up, let's give you a quick look at the stories we're keeping our eyes on. This is NC4 to watch. Now, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, has said the African continent needed more fiscal stimulus to engender economic growth and recovery. She said that developed countries are recovering very fast because they have been able to implement massive amounts of fiscal stimulus. Moving on from there, new streams of investments are heading to Africa's largest oil producer very soon. Nigeria has signed an accord with some of the world's largest oil companies that could unlock billions of dollars of investment in an offshore oil field. The NNPC concluded agreement on Tuesday with Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil Corporation, Total SA, and NESPA to create a new production sharing contract for OML 118. Third on our list, oil marketers got 1.07 billion shillings from the Treasury as compensation for keeping oil prices unchanged and diffusing public outrage over a monthly review that would have pushed costs to a historic high. The Kenyan Treasury gave the marketers about 880 million shillings after the energy regulator opted to cut suppliers' sales margin by up to 35% or 4.44 Kenyan shillings a litre to keep fuel prices unchanged in the month up to May 14th. And finally, Lesotho is facing the loss of revenue from water and power sales to South Africa and may see its share of an undersea communications cable seized after it breached the terms of a contract with Fraser Solar GmbH. Now, under a global enforcement order following the award of 50 million euros in damages in an arbitration case in South Africa, Fraser said in a statement that it has taken legal action to seize royalties that would be paid to Lesotho's government by Trans-Caledon Tunnel Authority, SOC, as well as payments for power from Eskom. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. Head to our website, download our mobile app on Play Store and App Store. And of course, you can take us with you wherever you go with the app. And you can also follow us on YouTube. And stay with us right here on News Central for all the latest coming from the African continent, because we put Africa first. I'm Tolu Nokwe Adeleru Balogun. I'll see you next time.